The boy stood barefoot on the cool stone floor, listening to voices he was not meant to hear. Beyond the thin wooden door, men spoke in low, careful tones. About armies, about alliances, about faith sharpened into command. The words slid together, heavy with consequence. The boy understood only fragments, but he understood enough to feel the weight of them settle somewhere deep in his chest. Yusuf did not move. He did not breathe loudly. He learned early that power listened best to silence. He was born in 1137 in the city of Tikrit, on the banks of the Tigris. His family was Kurdish, modest in ambition, but rich in loyalty. On the night of his birth, his father was ordered to leave the city in disgrace. It was said later that Yusuf arrived under the sign of exile, that destiny pushed him into the world already in motion. They left Tikrit before dawn. Yusuf grew up not in palaces, but in encampments and borrowed cities, Mosul, Baalbek, Damascus. He learned the sound of horses before he learned poetry. He learned the smell of steel, the discipline of prayer, the patience of waiting. He was not remarkable as a child. He did not dominate games. He did not boast. His eyes were thoughtful, his manner reserved. Men noticed his uncle more, Shirkuh, broad and loud, a warrior carved for war. Yusuf followed behind him like a shadow, absorbing everything, saying little. Too soft, some said. They were wrong. Yusuf learned restraint in a world drunk on conquest. He learned that men who rushed first often died first. That rage burned fast and left nothing but ash. When Nur ad-Din ruled Damascus, preaching unity against the Crusader states, Yusuf listened. He listened when others shouted. He watched when others struck. Egypt was the prize everyone wanted and no one could hold. The Fatimid Caliphate was rotting from within, rich and fragile. Nur ad-Din sent Shirkuh south with an army. Yusuf went with him, not as a commander, but as an observer. He saw betrayal passed like currency. He saw how power was taken not only by force, but by timing. In Cairo, Yusuf prayed more than he fought. He read, studied law, memorized scripture. Soldiers laughed at him. Then Shirkuh died suddenly. In the stunned quiet that followed, the unthinkable happened. Yusuf, young, quiet, underestimated, was named Vizier of Egypt. The Caliph believed he could control him. Yusuf did not argue. He did not celebrate either. Power settled on him slowly, like a garment he had not yet decided to wear. He reformed quietly. He replaced officials carefully. He ended the Fatimid Caliphate not with slaughter, but with procedure. One prayer changed, one name removed from the khutbah. Egypt shifted from Shia to Sunni rule almost without realizing it had happened. By then, Yusuf was no longer Yusuf. He was Salah ad-Din, Saladin. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, his empire cracked. Generals reached for pieces, cities hedged their loyalty. Saladin moved, not with speed but with inevitability. Damascus opened its gates, others followed. Those who resisted learned that mercy had limits. He united Egypt and Syria not as a conqueror alone, but as a ruler who paid his soldiers, respected scholars, and punished corruption with cold precision. He prayed often. He listened to jurists. He slept little. The Crusader states watched with growing dread. They had built their kingdoms on division. Saladin built his on unity. When he marched, it was not for glory, but for correction. Land taken by oath, lost by arrogance. Cities reclaimed not as trophies, but as obligations. In 1187, the moment came. The Crusader army met him near the horns of Hattin, thirsty, overconfident, divided. Saladin let the sun do part of his work. He let patience do the rest. When the battle ended, the kingdom of Jerusalem lay open. Saladin entered the city not as a butcher, but as a judge. He forbade massacre. He allowed ransom. He allowed prayer. Some called him merciful, others called him calculating. Saladin did not correct them. Jerusalem was his. But even as the city's gates closed behind him, Saladin knew the world would answer. He knew kings would rise across the sea. He knew one, in particular, would come not for land, but for honor. A lion would cross the water, and Saladin prepared to meet him. The sea brought news before it brought ships. Merchants arrived in Alexandria and Tyre, whispering of kings who had taken the cross. of banners raised in cathedrals far to the west. Saladin listened without interruption as reports piled upon one another. England, France, the Empire, names heavy with men and steel. "The Franks will come," his emirs said, "in numbers." Saladin nodded. "They always do." What troubled him was not the scale, but the quality. He knew the lesser princes well, their hunger for land, their quarrels, their impatience. But one name returned again and again, spoken with a different weight. Richard of England, a king who sold his own kingdom to finance war, a man who sang like a poet and fought like a storm, a ruler who loved battle more than rule. Saladin recognized the danger immediately. A man like that could not be managed, only endured. He began to prepare not for a single battle, but for years of attrition. Fortresses were strengthened, supply lines secured, wells guarded. He ordered restraint, even when his commanders urged aggression. "We will not bleed ourselves dry to impress God," Saladin said. "We will win by remaining whole." In 1189, Acre became the wound that would not close. The city, vital and stubborn, was encircled by Crusader forces that seemed endless. Saladin attacked repeatedly, probing for weakness, but the enemy clung to the coast like barnacles. Disease began to thin both sides. Summer rotted into despair. When Richard finally arrived in 1191, Saladin felt the shift immediately, like a change in the wind before a storm. Reports spoke of discipline, of fear restored among the Franks, of sudden brutal efficiency. "This one commands men as if they are part of his body," an emir said. Saladin considered that. "Then we must make the body ache." The siege dragged on until Acre surrendered. The executions that followed hardened resolve on both sides. Saladin did not flinch, but he marked it carefully. Mercy was a currency, so was terror. Richard had chosen his language. The campaign that followed was a study in contrast. Richard marched along the coast, shielded by the sea, daring Saladin to strike. Saladin harried, burned, withdrew, struck again. He tested Richard at Arsuf and was met with ferocity he had not underestimated, but had hoped to avoid. The defeat stung. Saladin retreated not in panic, but in calculation. He preserved his army, reinforced his positions, and waited. He watched Richard burn with momentum, watched illness and exhaustion creep in where enthusiasm had ruled. Between battles, messages passed, fruit packed in snow, physicians sent across lines, courtesy exchanged like blades wrapped in silk. "Why do you honor him?" a commander asked. "Because he honors the fight," Saladin replied, "and because hatred clouds judgment." As winter closed in, Jerusalem became the unspoken center of every council. Saladin fortified it, not with bravado, but with realism. He knew the city's meaning. He also knew its cost. Richard approached, then hesitated. From the hills, Saladin watched the Crusader army stall under rain and hunger. He understood then that the war would not be decided by walls, but by will. When envoys finally met, Saladin listened as terms were spoken carefully, each side pretending not to need the other. He respected Richard's refusal to gamble his army for a symbol, even as he knew that choice would haunt him. The treaty that followed settled nothing permanently. It merely paused the bleeding. Jerusalem remained under Muslim rule. Pilgrims would be allowed. The coast would hold. Saladin returned to the city he had fought to reclaim. He walked its streets quietly, unguarded, listening to prayer echo from stone that had seen too many flags. Victory tasted thin. He had won the land, but the war had carved years from him. His treasury was strained, his body ached. The unity he had forged required constant tending. When news came that Richard had been captured on his journey home, Saladin closed his eyes briefly. "So," he said, "the lion is caged." Some urged him to rejoice. Saladin did not. "A war does not end because a man is imprisoned," he said. "It ends when men no longer need it." He returned to Damascus in the years that followed, ruling with discipline and restraint. He gave generously to the poor, listened to scholars, punished betrayal without spectacle. But the weight never left him. He had become the symbol of unity, and symbols were not allowed to rest. As his health declined, Saladin thought often of the kings he had faced. Many blurred together, one did not. Richard had been his equal in will, if not in method. When Saladin fell ill in 1193, there was little left in his treasury. He had spent it on war, on faith, on the idea that justice required action. As he lay dying, he ordered a simple burial. No gold, no display, only the reminder that power, like conquest, was temporary. Jerusalem remained, and the world moved on. The room was quiet in a way Saladin had rarely allowed himself to experience. The walls were bare. The air smelled faintly of herbs and old parchment. Outside, Damascus breathed as it always had. Vendors calling, prayers rising, water moving through the channels he had ordered repaired years before. Life continued with an indifference that felt almost merciful. Saladin lay on a low bed, his hands folded loosely over his chest. They were thinner now. Veins stood out where strength once lived. The men who came and went spoke softly, as if volume alone might hasten the end. He listened. He always listened. In the weeks before, fever had come and gone like an unwelcome guest. His physician spoke in careful tones. Saladin needed no translation. He had watched enough men die to recognize the signs when they appeared in his own body. One evening, a young scholar sat beside him, tasked with reading from the Quran, when Saladin's strength failed. The boy's voice trembled at first. "Do not fear," Saladin said quietly. "Death does not hurry for those who have spent their lives in its shadow." The scholar swallowed and continued. In the long hours of wakefulness, memories returned unbidden. Tikrit, exile, the sound of hooves on packed earth, Shirkuh's booming laughter, Cairo's heat. The moment when a prayer changed and an empire shifted without blood. He remembered Jerusalem most vividly. Not its conquest, but the day after. The silence inside the city once the gates closed. The faces of its people, Muslim, Christian, Jewish. Fear, hope, calculation, relief. He had chosen restraint then, knowing full well that mercy would be mistaken by some for weakness. "I did not take Jerusalem to please the world," he murmured once. "I took it because it had been broken." He thought too of Richard, of their meetings through words carried by others, of the respect that had grown not in spite of war, but because of it. Saladin had understood him better than many allies he had commanded. Two men shaped by belief, two men trapped by expectation. Saladin had won Jerusalem, Richard had won legend. Which mattered more, Saladin wondered, as his breath shortened. In his final days, officials came with ledgers and accounts. They spoke of taxes, garrisons, unfinished matters of state. Saladin waved them away. "Give what remains to the poor," he said. "I will not argue with God over coins." They hesitated, then obeyed. When word spread that the Sultan's treasury was nearly empty, some were stunned. Others nodded in quiet recognition. Saladin had ruled not as a hoarder, but as a steward. On the morning of his death in 1193, sunlight crept through the window and rested on the floor beside his bed. Saladin watched it for a long moment, his eyes clear. "Lift the banner," he whispered. They did not understand at first. Then a simple cloth was brought, a plain shroud without ornament. Saladin nodded. "Let it be carried through the streets," he said, "so they will see what a ruler takes with him." Nothing. His final prayer was barely audible. When his breath stilled, there was no cry of alarm, no sudden chaos, only a quiet recognition that something vast had ended. The banner was raised as he had ordered. It moved through Damascus, carried by a single man. No gold, no title, just cloth in the wind. People stopped. They understood. Jerusalem did not fall when Saladin died, nor did it become safe forever. The world continued its turning, indifferent to virtue and cruelty alike. But something remained. Saladin was remembered not only as a conqueror, but as a measure, a standard against which rulers would be weighed and found wanting. Even his enemies spoke his name with restraint. Years later, travelers would stand in Jerusalem and argue over faith, over history, over whose claim was truer. Few would remember the man who had walked its streets quietly, refusing to stain them with vengeance. But the city remembered. And somewhere beyond time and banners, two kings, one who took Jerusalem and one who could not, were bound together by the same truth. That power is fleeting, that legacy is fragile, and that the hardest victories are the ones that demand restraint. The rest was left to history.